During my childhood, my family was like a small droplet in a vast river, never staying in one place for long. We settled in Rhode Island when I was 8 years old, and there we remained until I went off to college in Colorado Springs. Most of my memories are rooted in Rhode Island, but there are fragments tucked away in the recesses of my mind from the various homes we lived in during my earlier years. Many of these memories are hazy and inconsequential, chasing after another boy in the backyard of a North Carolina house, attempting to build a makeshift raft to float on the creek behind the Pennsylvania apartment we rented, and so on. However, there is one set of memories that remains crystal clear, as though they happened just yesterday. I often ponder whether these memories are mere lucid dreams brought on by a prolonged illness I endured that spring. But deep down, I am certain they are real. We were residing in a house just outside the bustling metropolis of Vineyard, Maine, with its population of 643. It was a rather spacious structure, especially for a family of 3. There were several rooms I never ventured into during the 5 months we called it home. In some ways, it felt like an excessive amount of space, but at the time, it was the only available house within an hour's commute to my father's workplace. The day after my 5th birthday celebration, which my parents celebrated alone due to my illness, I came down with a fever. The doctor diagnosed me with mononucleosis, which meant no rough play and enduring a fever for at least another 3 weeks. It was terrible timing to be bedridden. We were in the midst of packing our belongings for a move to Pennsylvania, and most of my possessions were already packed away in boxes, leaving my room stark and empty. My mother would bring me ginger ale and books several times a day, and these became my primary source of entertainment during those long weeks. Boredom constantly lurked around the corner, ready to exacerbate my misery. I don't exactly recall how I first encountered Mr. Widemouth. I believe it was about a week after my mono diagnosis. My earliest memory of the small creature was asking him if he had a name. He responded that I should call him Mr. Widemouth because of his unusually large mouth. Indeed, everything about him seemed disproportionately large compared to his small frame. His head, his eyes, his crooked ears, but his mouth stood out most of all. "You sort of look like a Furby," I remarked as he flipped through one of my books. Mr. Widemouth paused and looked at me with a puzzled expression. "Furby? What's a Furby?" he inquired. I shrugged. "You know, the toy, the little robot with big ears. You can pet and feed them, almost like a real pet." "Oh," Mr. Widemouth replied, resuming his activity. "You don't need one of those. They're not the same as having a real friend." I remember Mr. Widemouth vanishing each time my mother came to check on me. "I hide under your bed," he later explained. "I don't want your parents to see me, or they might not let us play anymore." During those initial days, we didn't do much. Mr. Widemouth would gaze at my books, captivated by the stories and illustrations within them. On the 3rd or 4th morning after we met, he greeted me with a wide smile. "I have a new game we can play," he said, "but we have to wait until after your mother checks on you. She can't see us playing it. It's a secret game." After my mother delivered more books and soda at the usual time, Mr. Widemouth crawled out from under the bed and tugged at my hand. "We need to go to the room at the end of this hallway," he instructed. Initially, I hesitated, as my parents had strictly forbidden me from leaving my bed without their permission. However, Mr. Widemouth persisted until I relented. The room in question lacked furniture or wallpaper. Its sole distinguishing feature was a window opposite the doorway. Mr. Widemouth darted across the room and pushed the window wide open, beckoning for me to look outside. We were on the 2nd story of the house, but the property was situated on a hill, making the drop seem greater than just 2 stories due to the steep incline. "I like to play make-believe up here," Mr. Widemouth explained. "I pretend there's a large, soft trampoline below this window, and I jump. If you pretend hard enough, you bounce back up like a feather. I want you to try." I was a 5-year-old with a fever, so a hint of doubt crossed my mind as I peered down and considered the possibility. "It's quite a long drop," I remarked, "but that's part of the fun. It wouldn't be fun if it were just a short drop. If it were, you might as well bounce on a real trampoline." I toyed with the idea, envisioning myself plummeting through the air only to spring back up to the window on something invisible to the human eye. Yet my practical side prevailed. "Perhaps another time," I replied. "I'm not sure if I have enough imagination, and I'm worried I might get hurt." For a brief moment, Mr. Widemouth's face twisted into a scowl, but it quickly shifted to disappointment. "If you say so," he conceded, retreating under the bed for the remainder of the day. The next morning, Mr. Widemouth arrived carrying a small box. "I want to teach you how to juggle," he declared. "Here are some items you can practice with before I begin giving you lessons." I peered into the box and found it filled with knives. My eyes widened in horror. "My parents will be furious," I exclaimed, shocked that Mr. Widemouth had brought knives into my room, objects my parents would never allow me to handle. "I'll be punished and grounded for a year." Mr. Widemouth frowned. "Juggling with these is so much fun. I want you to give it a try." I hastily pushed the box away. "I can't do it. I'll get into trouble. Knives aren't safe to toss in the air." Mr. Widemouth's frown deepened into a scowl. He took the box of knives and slid beneath my bed, where he remained for the rest of the day. I started to wonder just how often he hid under there. After that, I began to have difficulty sleeping. Mr. Widemouth frequently woke me up at night, claiming he had placed a real trampoline outside the window, a large one that I couldn't see in the darkness. I always declined and tried to return to sleep, but Mr. Widemouth persisted. Sometimes he stayed by my side until the early morning hours, urging me to jump. Playing with him was no longer enjoyable. One morning, my mother informed me that I had her permission to go outside and get some fresh air. She believed it would be good for me, especially after being confined to my room for so long. Ecstatic, I put on my sneakers and headed to the back porch, longing for the warmth of the sun on my face. Mr. Widemouth was waiting for me. "I have something I want to show you," he said. I must have given him a puzzled look because he quickly added, "It's safe, I promise." I followed him to the beginning of a deer trail that wound through the woods behind our house. "This is a special path," he explained. "I've taken many friends your age down this path to a special place. You're not quite ready yet, but one day I hope to take you there." I returned to the house, wondering what kind of place lay beyond that trail. 2 weeks after I had first met Mr. Widemouth, our belongings were loaded onto a moving truck. I would be sitting in the cab with my father for the long journey to Pennsylvania. I considered telling Mr. Widemouth about my departure, but even at the age of 5 I began to suspect that his intentions were not entirely benign, despite his assurances. That's why I decided to keep my departure a secret. My father and I were in the truck by 4 a.m. He was determined to reach Pennsylvania by lunchtime the following day, fueled by an endless supply of coffee and a 6-pack of energy drinks. He seemed more like a marathon runner than someone about to spend 2 days in a vehicle. "Early enough for you?" he asked. I nodded and leaned my head against the window, hoping to get some sleep before the sun rose. I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. "This is the last move, son, I promise. I know it's been tough on you, especially with your illness. Once Dad gets that promotion, we'll settle down and you can make new friends." I opened my eyes as we pulled out of the driveway. I saw Mr. Widemouth's silhouette in my bedroom window. He stood motionless until the truck was about to turn onto the main road. With a pitiful little wave goodbye, he held a steak knife in his hand. I didn't wave back. Years later, I returned to New Vineyard. The piece of land where our house had once stood was empty, except for the foundation, as the house had burned down a few years after my family left. Out of curiosity, I followed the deer trail that Mr. Widemouth had shown me. Part of me half expected him to jump out from behind a tree and startle me, but I felt that Mr. Widemouth was gone, somehow tied to the house that no longer existed. The trail led me to the new Vineyard Memorial Cemetery. I noticed that many of the tombstones belonged to children.